Now, let's get started. This is a summary of all of the introduction for pdfToolbox 13 that happened last week in Berlin. And this is a picture I took just before the event of the high technology in Berlin. If you don't recognize that, that is a Trabant. That seem to be really nice tours driving these, where at least one car fails at some point, so lots of fun guaranteed. This is not what we're going to talk about, however. What we're going to talk about is pdfToolbox 13, which has been released, so you can go to callassoftware.com to download it. And even if you don't have a license key yet, you can use a trial and start a trial, and that will give you 15 days to play with the software. And there is also already lots of information that you can look at the same time. So go to help.callassoftware.com. You will find all the documentation for the new features in the pdfToolbox 13 manual that is on there. And then you can also already go to YouTube, look for the Callas Software channel, and there most or all of the videos that were recorded last week are online already as well. So lots of stuff to get you going. The purpose of today is to give a bit of a summary of what is new in pdfToolbox 13. Before we start with that, let me give you the opportunity to put these two dates in your agenda. For the first time in more than 2 years, I think, we also hope a little bit, but we already plan to have a PDF Camp event live in Berlin. You can see where it's going to go through. This is the same location where the pdfToolbox 12 introduction event was recorded, where we broadcasted that. It's a nice hotel. It's very close to a good sushi restaurant, but then most of Berlin is very close to a good sushi restaurant, so that is not too difficult. No invitations for it yet. You can't register for it yet, but you can already put this in your calendar and you will get an invitation and a possibility to register soon. This is going to be like I was going to say old PDF Camp events, but the ones we did in the past before this whole pandemic messed up our lives. Same format, so we plan to start around 10, 11. We plan to end around 3, 4 in the afternoon the second day. So plan on being there for 2 days, and you can bring whatever question you have on Callas software or on PDF or a mixture. And of course, we expect that there might be lots of questions about pdfToolbox 13 specific stuff, but anything goes really. This is going to be a bit of a challenge. I promised myself I was going to try and do this in about 45 minutes to an hour. You don't know what is coming, but I do. I am planning or trying to condensate, summarize 8 hours of content that we presented last week into 45 minutes. So that is not an easy task. If I don't mention your favorite feature that you saw last week, well, you saw it last week, so that should not be the end of the world. I scrapped a lot of things. I'm not going to mention lots of details about things that I could do. I will try to show some stuff here and there as well. We'll see how that works out in terms of time. I've kind of grouped this in different areas if you want. And the first one that we're going to start with is user interface. Usually I try to talk nice and slowly. I'm afraid I don't have that luxury today. So we're going to see how quickly I can speak in English. I was taught by very good people to do so. So that should not be a big issue either. If it gets too quick and you can't follow anymore, raise your hand and interrupt. User interface. This grouping is quite loose. You will see that. I've tried to group things together, but yeah, you'll see. So let's get started. First thing, and even while preparing this this session, this already came in quite useful, is that you could already search other libraries for fix-ups and checks and profiles and so on that were in there, but you still had to go to manage libraries to then copy stuff into the current library, and that has been altered a little bit. So if you're creating a process plan now, there is a button that you can click, and that brings up an import dialog or import window, and in there you can search different libraries. You can find what you're interested in and then import it in the current library that you have. And that means you don't have to close the process plan editor and then go find it and then open your process plan again, and which is a huge time saver there. And the same has been implemented in the fix-up window, check window, profiles window, where you can now search across all libraries, and then you can say copy into current library, and that just makes a copy into the library you're working in. Very small thing, huge time saver. And there's actually quite a few of these things that you'll see in this presentation, features that by themselves are quite small, but if this is something that you work with, is a big deal. This certainly for me is a big deal. Next feature is kind of the opposite, if you want. What that allows you to do is to say, okay, so I've imported a process plan or a profile. I actually didn't need it, so I could already go in and delete that process plan again. But if that process plan uses other checks and fix-ups and so on, so all these things that are referenced by the process plan would normally stay behind. And so if you have a very clean library and you mistakenly imported a big process plan that imports lots of other stuff, then you had to manually clean that out. Now there is something that is called delete process plan with referenced objects, and that will not only delete the process plan, but also all the other stuff it points to. Only, of course, if that other stuff isn't used by something else. So it's not going to delete a fix-up that you are also already using in a different process plan, for example. By the way, if you're paying lots of attention and you see the typo that is on the screen there, that has already been fixed meanwhile in the software. Other small thing, but again, for me, a quite important one, is that if you're creating a process plan and then you're working on it and you're adding stuff and you're configuring things, especially if you're using test mode, you can be working in the process plan editor for quite a long time before clicking OK, and only when you click OK, normally the process plan is then saved. And not that I want to imply that pdfToolbox would ever crash, but sometimes some other application on your system does something bad and you might end up in trouble. So there is now a save button on the process plan editor, and clicking that will save your work without forcing you to click OK and then reopening it and so on. Small thing, really, really useful. A much bigger thing, actually, and also quite useful and much more visible if you use one of these. If you work with pdfToolbox, throughout the application, what you will see is configuration files. And you can see two of them here on this slide. One is a dot gain curve. So there is a fix-up that allows you to apply a dot gain curve. And you have to create these curves somehow, and that is in a configuration file, which is a tab-based text file. And one of the fix-ups around fonts uses a font substitution policy, which is another tab-based text file. There exist more throughout pdfToolbox, including the imposition configuration files, for example. All have a particular syntax. And what happened in pdfToolbox 13 is that callas implemented an editor for these configuration files. And the editor is quite smart. As you can see here, it does color coding. The keywords, for example, are highlighted, so you really know what you're working with. And it also does code completion. So as you type substitute in this case, you can see that it shows you in the editor on the right that you can choose between substitute all or substitute first. So the fact that it knows the syntax and it can help you do the right thing, also the fact that it shows these hidden characters in there and so on, can be very, very useful. Yeah? And I'm not going to show you the imposition configuration files because that will come back a little bit later, but these different configuration files throughout the product, you now have an integrated editor for those. And then another small but important thing, and I want to just show that actually what I can do now is when I click Shift and then I drag a rectangle. In the past, something would happen, now something else happens. So when I do that, I zoom in on that area of the file, and then of course I still have the shortcut keys to go back to the full view, but clicking Shift and dragging a rectangle zooms in on that portion of the file. If I click and I also hit the Alt or Option key, then that area opens up in the loop window, which was part of pdfToolbox for a long time. The zooming was introduced in pdfToolbox 12, but the fact that you can now Shift and then drag a rectangle and zoom in on that area will make it much, much easier to examine a particular object in that document. Okay, so small user interface thing, again, very useful. There are, by the way, and they are here on the slide, but you can easily see them in the product as well, of course. There are, of course, a bunch of other shortcut keys that you can use for zooming, and well, just look at the view menu and zoom, and then you'll see them there as well. Something that is specifically for pre-flight checks is that if you are working with processing steps, and if you don't know what processing steps are, very short explanation is that they are a way to mark layers or optional content groups, as they are called, in PDF with metadata. And that allows you to identify parts of the PDF file that is used for a particular purpose. And a good example is if I attach structural and then cutting as information to a layer, the expectation is that that layer will then contain the die line or the cut contour, whatever you want to call it, in a packaging workflow or label workflow. And you could already work with processing steps in checks because you can make conditions that refer to a particular processing step and then use that to filter. But in pdfToolbox 13, on the left-hand side of the pre-flight check editor, you have now a pull-down menu that allows you to make that selection much easier, and where you can say, for example, in this check, I'm only interested in, real objects of the file that are not contained in any processing step. And then I would put it on exclude processing step objects. So much easier that way. If you want to filter a particular processing step, so for example, only this structural cutting information that I mentioned before, you could still augment that with conditions in the pre-flight check to do that. But the basic selections are already provided just on the left-hand side of the pre-flight window. Something that is going to save me lots of time, even if only because it has, and you can see that at the top of the top screenshot there, it says inwards is negative, outwards is positive. This is something that I always got wrong in pdfToolbox, so I always had to make a check or a fix-up twice in order to get the desired result. Now I have the explanation right there in the user interface, but more importantly, in those cases where you want to select a custom area of a page, in all those locations, you now have two different ways of doing it. Yeah? In previous versions of pdfToolbox, in one location, one thing was implemented, in another fix-up or check, another way was implemented. Now, in every case where you have the ability to, or the need to select or identify a custom page area, you have this pull-down menu that lets you choose between offsets or offset and width and height. So if you want to work with something, for example, that is the trim box, but just a little bit smaller, then you use offsets to box edges. If you know what the offset is towards the left-hand side and the bottom side, and you know what the width and height is that you want, then you use offset and width and height. The fact that you always have both options makes it much, much easier to work with that. Of course, there's going to be some conversion going on when you upgrade existing stuff to this, but that shouldn't change the behavior of what you already have in checks and fixes. Next, and this is actually more than just user interface changed, it's also a functionality change, and you'll see that. The first thing that happened here, you have pdfToolbox 12 on the right and pdfToolbox 13 on the left. So the first thing that happened is that these configuration options you have for the comparison feature, that these have been grouped in something called thresholds and then something called measurements. Yeah, so that's why there is so much difference. They have been grouped, and to make it a little bit clearer. But if you pay attention, you will see that you have 5 options on the right-hand side. You have 6 on the left-hand side. The new one is this contiguous area option that is highlighted on the left. What this does is, while it is doing comparison in pdfToolbox, it will only flag something as a difference if it is larger than the area value, the value that you have there. In this example, 3 millimeter. Yeah? So in order for something to be a change, there needs to be a contiguous area in the file that violates the other parameters that you have there. In this case, a delta E difference of 4. That can help you in filtering out really small areas on the page where you have an overrun, while these might not make a real difference. While it might not cause production problems if that is the case, well, this gives you an extra parameter to filter that out. And that is not the only change for comparison stuff. If you look in the, for example, process plan editor, but this is also something that has been implemented, for example, in the command line options, you'll see that there is now a page selector for the current PDF and the compared PDF. Now, page selector, I am not going to explain because I will get back to that at some point. That deserves a little bit more explanation. What is important here is that this allows me to work with different page ranges in the 2 files that I am comparing. Example, let's say that I have a workflow that adds a cover page to a document, but I still want to compare these 2 files afterwards. And of course, I don't want to compare that cover page that I added. Well, I could say compare page 1 in my original document with page 2 in the document that was modified in my workflow. And with page ranges, that can be quite flexible. It could be page 1 to 5 in the first document and page 2 to 6 in the second document and stuff like that. So small change, really important if you want to do comparison, but you also insert pages or modify things or shuffle things around as you're working with a document. Good. That was section number 1. And we'll see how far we get to 45 minutes. My hope is not too high at this point, but we'll see. The second section I've called engines. And what that means is that it is stuff that is a little bit more behind the scenes. In some cases, completely behind the scenes. In some cases, there is still user interface to configure it or link to it, but it is more of the underlying technology implementations. And what I'm beginning with is something that is completely invisible, but could still be a big deal. I think for us, as we are involved in support, this is also going to be a big deal. And what it is a better handling of some invalid PDF files. In some case, when a PDF file is corrupt and you try to do something with it and you modify it and then you want to save it, you won't be able to save it and you'll get a dialog box like the one you see on screen there. In some cases, that is unfixable. At least pdfToolbox doesn't have enough information to actually decide what a good fix would be. But in lots of cases, these things are reported over and over again. So it can be pinned down to a particular problem introduced by some other application, for example. And in pdfToolbox 13, there are a lot more of the silent repairs, if you want, that pdfToolbox can do in order to change or fix these broken files. And the test that was run says that around 40% of the known corrupt files that we have gotten from support can now be actually silently fixed. And like I said, it's completely invisible. This doesn't have any user interface. You'll just see that some files that didn't work before now will work automatically. Of course, this will be done only if there is a safe fix and there is a pretty good understanding that the thing that needs to be corrected is not going to cause other issues while correcting it. Actually not a new fix-up. The fix-up already existed, but another addition that was made is to a fix-up where you can create links. In the past, the hyperlink that you, the destination URL as it is called there, that you wanted to create was a fixed thing. So I could search for callas software and then link it to the callas software website, but I could not search for any form of URL or any form of email address, and then automatically link it to that URL that was found or that email address that was found. And in pdfToolbox 13, I can do that, and that works using what is called back references, and that uses a feature of regular expressions where you can use groups that identify the whole thing that you found or parts of the thing that you found, and that can then be used in the destination URL field. This $1 that you see in there is the way of doing that. It's a standard regular expression feature, and you will find, if you search on internet, you will find a lot of documentation on how that actually works, or use a site like regex 101, and that can help you in creating the regular expression that you need. Something else is that you could actually, of course, always downsample images in pdfToolbox. What less people know is that you could also upsample images. You just have to set correct parameters in pdfToolbox in order to do so. In pdfToolbox 13, there are two new fix-ups that are explicitly called Upsample Compress and then a type of image. And this is mostly to make it clear what is going to happen there and make it easier for people to find it. Also important, and perhaps more important, is that there are two new algorithms that have been implemented in pdfToolbox 13. Before, the bicubic downsampling or upsampling algorithm was the highest quality one that you had in the product. In version 13, you now also have Blackman Sync and Lanxos. Lanxos is the one that is used in the default predefined fix-ups in version 13, because generally you'll see that the quality is better, and from a processing time point of view, it is comparable to a bicubic downsampling or upsampling anyway. It's a little bit hard to show you what that really looks like. Well, I can't really go beyond what I do here. you have it in the product, try it out, and see which of these algorithms works best on the type of stuff that you're dealing with. In pdfToolbox, you have a technology called place content that has been there for a while. And as you know, place content uses HTML templates, and then it converts the template into a PDF, and that is used to overlay or underlay the current PDF file. And you can use this to decorate the PDF with text or barcodes or a combination or other graphical elements. There are also easier versions of the technology, and you can see one here called place text. What was a bit of a shame in pdfToolbox before is that I could place text, but the way to choose a font was rather limited. What I could do is I could say Arial or Helvetica or even sans or sans serif, and then the HTML engine behind would find a font for me that matched that. What I could not do, for example, is say, I want Helvetica black. Because in that case, the HTML engine would not be able to find a connection between that string Helvetica black that you can put in there and the actual font file that you want to use. In version 13, in order so that you don't have to make a complex template, if all you want to do is add text and select a specific font, you now have two different ways of specifying a font in the place text, but also place barcode and place page number fix-ups. The first one is a web font, and as you can see there, that allows me to have a link to a font file somewhere on the internet. In this case, that's a link to a Roboto font. And if I do this, then that font will be downloaded and used in the place text fix-up. But there is perhaps an even more interesting way, and that is using font from library. If you have a font with the right permissions and you have the right permission for a font in order to work with it in this way, then you can store a font file into a pdfToolbox library. And then once it has been stored in that library using that import functionality that you see there, once it is in the library, then you can use that font in, for example, place text. And again, that allows me to select something like Helvetica black, the font file for Helvetica black. And in that case, I would, without any problem, specify a particular variant of a font family. Or I could do something more exotic, like what you see on screen, find a Klingon font and then use that. I'm sure you've been wanting to add Klingon to your PDF files for a long time, so now you can. Another small but important change is there were some checks for effective ink coverage, some generic ones that test the whole document, and then there was a check that also looked at ink coverage in a custom area. The annoying thing was you couldn't, for example, say effective ink coverage for separated plates in custom area. That didn't exist. Now, there are two ways to fix this, and the way Callas decided to use is the more flexible one, I believe. So instead of having a condition for effective ink coverage in custom area, what they did was create a condition, effective ink coverage limit to custom area. And that can now be combined with other conditions for ink coverage. So in a check, I could use the effective ink coverage for separated plates condition. And then additionally, I can have this limit to custom area condition. And like that, I limit the checking that is done. What was also difficult there is, yeah, you can limit to a custom area, but how can you be 100% sure that you're looking at the right thing? Well, if you use the test environment, there is actually a checkbox at the bottom of that test window where you can switch on and off different diagnostics. One of the things you can switch on now is ink coverage. And if you do that and you run a check that works with ink coverage, pdfToolbox will create a TIFF file that shows you what the area is that was checked. Yeah? And you can use this to validate that the area that you're setting up, and perhaps that area is calculated dynamically with variables or so on. So this allows you to check that the right thing was checked. Okay, next thing. And this, I chose tiling here. That's what you see on the slide, but actually this is bigger than that. One of the issues that we've also encountered a couple of times is that you can make a process plan, and in a process plan, you can have actions. And actions are typically things that you can't do with a fix-up or check in a pre-flight profile, but they can be imported in a process plan using actions. However, there were a few things that you could do with the CLI that were CLI commands, and tiling is an example of that. So you could do them on the command line, but you could not use them inside of a process plan because you could not make them into an action. In pdfToolbox 13, almost all things that you can do in the command line, and I say almost all on purpose because there are still some exceptions, but almost all things you can run on the command line, you can now also have in a process plan. And that is quite nice if you want to make a process plan that does a whole bunch of steps, one after the other, and integrates them. At least now you can do so, and you don't have to split it up into multiple steps and then do a command line call and things like that. So tiling that I have here is an example. There are a number of other actions that were added to the product so that you can use all of those in process plans as well. Something new, a new action in pdfToolbox, and this looks really, really simple. It is actually much simpler to use than it is to implement because you have to do all kinds of font shenanigans to implement it. But a thing that you can do now is unembed fonts. Usually this is not something that you want to do, or you want to have embedded fonts, but there are situations where you would wish that you could remove an embedded font file from a PDF document, and then, for example, because you want to merge font files, you want to merge a bunch of PDF files together or something like that. So there is now an action that can do that, and there is another new action, something completely different, but also new action that allows you to resample to JPEG 2000 using an actual, a quite nice algorithm to do it with relatively high compression ratios. The way it has been implemented means that you only have 3 options. You have the option to limit it to color images, to grayscale images, or to all images. So you can't use these apply to filters that use a pre-flight check that you have in many other actions and fix-ups. But it is a good compression to JPEG 2000, and if the compression would result in a larger image than the original, then there is a checkbox that you can switch on, and that will make sure that it won't happen in that case. In many times when you do compression, it will be it will allow you to compress all images quite well, but there might be some images where it goes haywire and it causes the image to get actually bigger than what you had before. Specifically, if you go from JPEG to JPEG 2000, or you go to from zip encoding to JPEG 2000, in that case, you can make sure that the image will never get bigger. The compression will just not be done if it would be bigger. Another very nice addition to the process plan editor. And yes, it's also UI because there is an extra checkbox, but it is the functionality in this case is much more important than the UI. In more complex process plans, it is possible that you need to create intermediate files. I've done that a couple of times myself, and that works quite well. You can also reference those files that you've created and do things with them. The annoying thing is that these temporary files would also survive at the end of the process plan. So you run your process plan, it generates the output that you want, but it also generates 2 temporary files, for example. In pdfToolbox 13, there is now a new property for a step that says delete after processing, and that will allow you to designate the result of a step as a temporary file. And that means that at the end of the process plan, it will be deleted. Yeah? So I can create 2 temporary files and then output a result file. And the only thing that the user will see at the end, or that you will see at the end, is that result file. The temporary files are automatically deleted again. Small change, but still an important change. You had in pdfToolbox the ability to use a command line parameter called max memory that limits the memory usage for pdfToolbox. And that command line parameter was there because on Linux, there was a provision in the operating system that did that. And so basically this command line parameter, all pdfToolbox does is use the operating system a tool that is there or built-in support in the operating system that makes this work. From pdfToolbox 13, this is now also possible on Windows platforms, and it can be used on the command line using the same max memory command line parameter. There is also an environment variable that you can use in the SDK, and you can see it listed there, and it will have the exact same effect as on Linux, that the memory available to the pdfToolbox process is limited to whatever amount of megabytes that you specify in the command line parameter or in the environment variable. I would say another small change, but I think this is a bit of a bigger change in some cases. A very common task in pdfToolbox is the generation of images. And that is because people want thumbnail images or preview images. In some cases, you even want high resolution renders of each page in order to send them directly to a RIP. So the generation of images is quite a common thing. And of course, you know that in pdfToolbox, you can do multiple things in parallel. If you're using the CLI or the server or the SDK, you can do multiple things in parallel, normally 8 parallel processes if you have the hardware or virtual hardware for that. However, if I'm generating these images and I have a file that has 100,000 pages, then I'm in a bit of, I'm in a bit of a pickle, as one says in English, because well, it's only going to be one process that generates all 100,000 images, and there is no way to speed that up. Each PDF file is handled by one process in pdfToolbox. In version 13, there is an exception for save as image, where you can now, with the parallel parameter, specify how many processes should convert images or should create images in parallel from your original PDF file. And that means that in this 100,000 page document, you can use multiple parallel processes that all work on the same file in generating images, and so the result should be much faster. Remark, and just to make this really, really clear, remark that this is only true for the save as image action to generate images. This has no effect on other processing of PDF documents. In general, parallel processing of PDF documents during pre-flight or with process plans is quite complex. Because of the structure of PDF, it is really complex to do that in parallel. So it is only when you are generating images. Okay, that was the engines section. And then I have a number of last things if you want, but remember again that each of these things I'm going to cover now, last week was a session of 45 minutes to 1 hour, so I'm skipping lots and lots of detail. Go and look up the videos from last week's event if you want to see everything about a particular feature or read about it in the documentation. But here's an overview. And the first one of those larger topics is arbitrary JavaScript control checks. And what that is a condition in the document group. So if you create a new pre-flight check, you can search for the arbitrary JavaScript control checks condition. Actually, I think if you type JavaScript, there is only going to be one, but I haven't tried that. So you can look for that and you can add it to your pre-flight check. And what that allows you to do is to write some JavaScript, and that will cause pdfToolbox to dynamically create conditions to the current pre-flight check that you're creating, or add complete checks. And this is a bit of a weird thing in pdfToolbox. Normally, what would happen is that when you run a pre-flight check, you run a pre-flight check and that's it. And you get a hit or you don't get a hit. Here, you can run a pre-flight check and that can do all kinds of other things. And I will show you a demo in a second to make that a little bit more clear. Conceptually, this is very similar to the same feature for fix-ups that was introduced in pdfToolbox 12. So if you've looked at that or used that, this is very, very similar. It uses JavaScript, like I said, and the way it works, and this is how most of these implementations in pdfToolbox work, the way it works is that you have to create and return an object with a specific structure that pdfToolbox understands. And then pdfToolbox looks at that object that you create in your JavaScript, and it dynamically creates either conditions or one or more checks. Okay, so I will need to quit the presentation for that, and I'm going to go to my documents, and then obviously, as always, this Zoom interface thing is in my way. So I need checks, and what I'm going to do is run very quickly one pre-flight check on here that gives me, it uses a variable, so I can say, oh, I'm interested in spot color called cut, and then I run that, and it tells me that there are 37 matches. That is not very, very special. But now when I show you what this pre-flight check looks like, you can see that instead of just using standard conditions, it uses a bit of JavaScript. And this is integrated in the JavaScript environment for pdfToolbox, which means if you want to use variables from a previous step in a process plan, then you can use that. You can do that by looking at the app.vars object. If you want to know something about the document, you can look at app.doc. If you want to tell pdfToolbox that it should ask for a variable, you can use app.requires as it is there. So it's really integrated in the same environment that you also have in JavaScript variables. And what you need to do is you need to return an object, and that is exactly what happens here. I have an object with some conditions, and at the end, I return that object to pdfToolbox. And what I put in there are the conditions. Now, if you want to know where these conditions come from and so on, you have some support for that in this flyout window. You can insert a base check, and then pdfToolbox will allow you to configure a check with multiple conditions, and it will show you what the JavaScript looks like. You can say insert configured check, and that allows you to pick an existing check and then insert that as JavaScript. And that makes it easy to figure out what you need to put in here and then modify it to your heart's content. Bottom line, this is the pre-flight check that I am using, and my JavaScript code in this example only inserts or dynamically creates the conditions that I want. That is not too complex, and it's actually not too strange yet. What is much stranger is this check that I have here, which is called artificial check for spot colors. And if I run that, now it gets really weird because now I get 4 results, and that should not be possible. I'm using one pre-flight check, and when I run an individual pre-flight check, I should always get either nothing if there is no hit found, or I should get the hits, and then it should be an error. That is how every other pre-flight check I have in this window works. Not this one. Here I have 4 results, 2 of them list as an error, and 2 of them list as a warning. And again, this is done using the same condition as I showed before. And what I did now is create a list with names that I'm interested in. So gold, silver, cut, and so on. And for each of those, I also identified whether I think of these as an error when they exist, or I consider them to be a warning. And using the same kind of JavaScript code, I am creating an object, and in this case, I am going to put complete new dynamically created checks in that object. And at the end of my code, I am returning that to pdfToolbox. pdfToolbox creates these checks for me. Why do I have 5 items in my array here and only 4 results? Because in my array, I also have silver, but my document does not contain silver. So when I run this, I only get 4 results. Silver was not found. These checks behave as normal checks. So if I take this artificial check for spot colors and I put it in a pre-flight profile, then pdfToolbox is just going to create what you just saw, and these results would be coming from my pre-flight profile as well. So I can use it in a pre-flight profile. I can use it in a process plan. If I want to use the app.results object, JavaScript object, to then look at these hits that I found and so on, all of that is possible. It behaves exactly the same as normal pre-flight checks would behave. The only thing that is a little bit weird is that I have one check here and that it dynamically creates all the stuff that I need from there using the JavaScript. So if you want to do things that are dynamic, you now have the ability to run dynamic or to create dynamic fix-ups, starting with pdfToolbox 12. And you now also have the ability to create checks with JavaScript starting from pdfToolbox 13. So you can now dynamically create almost a complete pre-flight profile with lots of stuff in there. Really cool stuff. Next, pages. And this is another area that is, this actually to me looks like a very small change, but it is not, and don't be confused by that. It is not, it is really powerful, and it can be used in so many places to do things that were very difficult up to now or impossible up to now, that this is absolutely cool. So what is it? Well, what it is something called page selectors, and I already mentioned them when I talked about the new stuff in the compare step in process plan. And a page selector was already used in pdfToolbox. And more specifically, if you would look at the split PDF command in the command line version, then the split scheme parameter for that already used page selectors of some sort. What are page selectors? Well, here you see a number of examples, and from the very simple one, like page 1-100, which means start at page 1 and go to page 100, or 1-1, and that's the second one that you see there, which means start at page 1 and go to page -1. And when there is a minus, it starts counting from the end of the document. So this is actually everything in the document from page 1 to the last page in the document. Then you can build ranges with that, things like 1-2, which would mean page 1 and page 2, or the very complex looking but very logical -2-1. And what that means is take the second last page of the document and then go to the last page of the document. So that expression that you have there actually selects 4 pages. In a 25-page document, it would select 1, 2, 24, and 25. And then you can mix these together, of course. So the next expression would give me page 10, page 4, page 1, page 2, and then page 7. And in addition to that, there is a joker that you can use, and that gives me all pages that were not selected by what comes before. So in the example, I still have page 10, 4, 1, 2, and 7, and then that is followed by all other pages that weren't selected yet, and you can see them there. So these page selectors start from the very simple to the much more complex. And there are many more things that you can do there that are really interesting, like give me every 5th page and give me chunks of 3 pages or things like that. So read the documentation to learn about all of them. What is important then, of course, is that this has been integrated in a number of places throughout pdfToolbox. You already saw it in the compare, where it can be used to say, which pages from document A do you want to compare with which pages of document B? So there it is integrated, but it's also been integrated in an action called split or reorder. There is also new quick fixes, invert page order and reorder pages that also use these. And there are other locations. So basically everywhere where it is important to select one or more pages, you now have the opportunity to also do that with page selectors. Side note, why would you use a fix-up instead of an action? Because here, some of the things that you can do can be done either with an action or with a quick fix, and there are more areas in pdfToolbox where this is the case. You can see it at the bottom. If we do a split or reorder of a large file with an action, it takes 45 seconds. If you do the same thing with a quick fix, it takes 3 seconds. So quick fixes are a lot quicker. That is what you would expect in the majority of cases, no? And then the next thing, but before I do that, I also want to at least show you something about these page things. So I have prepared something here, and that is an action. Actually, I can make this window a little smaller. So this is an action. It is called extract cover pages. It uses the split and reorder action, and then you can see here that it says 1, 2, -2, -1. And those are the 4 pages that I want to extract. If I want to appear smarter or I want to hide what I'm doing, I can also rewrite this as, now I have to make sure I do it correctly. So now I'm saying the range from 1 to 2, and then the range from -2 to -1. This is exactly the same as what I had before, but it looks much cooler this way. So let's see whether I got that right or I just shot myself in the foot. Put this on the desktop, and there we go. And the result is that I now have a 4-page document, with pages 1 and 2. This was a 25-page document beforehand. So then I have 24 and 25. So this allows me to select some of the pages from a PDF file And then perhaps the next thing in the process plan that I could do is work with these pages and do something specific. Maybe I want to convert them to some other format because they are tab pages or it's a cover and I want to do something special with them. I can do that in a process plan and then maybe combine them again with the original document at some point as well. Okay. Like I said, you can do all kinds of interesting things here. For example, I also made an action that says every 5th page, and that I could do like this, and that gives me every 5th page, asterisk, and then 5 tells pdfToolbox, pick every 5th page. The annoying thing is what this is going to give you is probably not what you want, or it might not be what you want. This is going to give you page 1, page 6, page 11, and so on. Why? It starts at page 1, and then each time it counts to 5 before giving you the next one. What you might expect or what you might want is page 5, page 10, page 15, and so on. And I can do that. I just have to use an offset. So if I add a 5 in between parentheses there, then I'm telling pdfToolbox, give me every 5th page, but start at page 5. So the first page is now page 5, and then I'm also going to get page 10 and 15 and 20 and 25. Yeah? So really, really useful. And the example that I'm giving here is actually something that I encountered in real life about 6 months ago. An action I needed, or a fix-up in this case, I needed to do on every 3rd page. But unfortunately, I didn't want page 369, I wanted page 147. And that was very, very difficult to do. And I ended up having a long list in there to make sure that it would work for all the documents we were processing. With this, I could perfectly well implement exactly what I want by saying every 3rd page, and then you add a start page, starting at page 1, which is the default anyway, or starting at page 2, and that would allow me to do exactly the selection that I want. So really cool stuff, and implemented not only as an action, but also implemented as a quick fix, also integrated into compare, also integrated into some of the conditions that exist, like the sequential page number condition throughout the product review. Okay. We're getting closer to the end, by the way, so it might not be too horrible. Shingling. Shingling is the effect of paper having thickness when you're doing impositions for bound materials, things like books and magazines and so on, that, for example, are saddle stitched. If I have a number of sheets and I fold them together and then you look at what happens, well, what happens is what you see on the right-hand side, very exaggerated, where things will not be completely straight anymore. And so when you do this to a book, you can cut the end, but the problem is that your page content is also going to be affected. Because these pages have thickness and they are not folded nicely into each other, what you'll see in practice is that it will look as if the page content shifts throughout the book. And of course, what I'm putting here is hugely exaggerated, and you would not see this in a real book, but you will see some shifts in books, and it's large enough that it has to be corrected for. And so in pdfToolbox 13, you could do shingling in older versions, but in 13, there are a number of new parameters that control a new way of doing shingling. And you can see them listed there. Things like the staple size, which is the number of sheets that are put on top of each other and then folded. The direction and increment that then are directly related to the correction method that you are implementing. The first one is very similar to what already existed before. It is called shift. And what it does to correct for the shingling effect is shift pages either to the left or to the right or in both directions. But It uses now all of these new parameters like the staple size to make it easier and more accurate in an imposition configuration. The second possibility that was introduced in 13 is scale, and scale is actually squeezing the page content horizontally. So vertically, nothing changes, everything keeps the same height, but horizontally, you squeeze the page content in order to minimize the visual effect of the shingling. And then the downside of that, of course, is that you're not scaling proportionally, but squeezing content. And the third method, scale P, is a proportional scale. So while that then affects not only horizontally the page content, but also vertically, it does keep the correct proportions of everything. And then we're not done with imposition yet. We still have JavaScript Run Lists. And that to me is also a pretty important topic, not only because lots of people use imposition, but also because lots of people use imposition in ways that it was not meant to be used as part of specific process plans to accomplish something to a PDF file. And so anything that makes creating imposition more powerful or easier, in my book, is an important thing. In pdfToolbox 12, as you probably know if you've used imposition, there is a sheet config and a run list file. Both of these use a proprietary callas syntax, that is a text language that is tab delimited. And then there is also a possibility to use a background file, and the background file can be used to include marks and stuff like that. The imposition actually happens on top of the background file if it is there. If it's not there, it happens on top of an empty sheet. Yeah? But the important part here is that the sheet config and the run list always are these tab delimited files. No longer in pdfToolbox 13. Now you have the ability to use JavaScript in the run list file for the imposition. You can still use the sheet configuration file. It is still there. You can still use it to define sheets, to define slots on a sheet, just like before, but you don't have to. You can, if you want, put everything in this JavaScript run list file, and that works in the same way as what I explained before for the JavaScript checks, in the sense that you need to create an object, and that object needs to have the correct structure, and then pdfToolbox is going to use the information in that object to give you an imposed file. The legacy imposition is still fully supported, of course, that doesn't change. So if you have a bunch of run lists and sheet configs that you've created in the past, and you want to continue using that, or if you want to continue creating new sheet config and run lists like you did before, then you can. It is supported. It is not going to change, obviously. But if you want to complement what you're doing with JavaScript and you want to switch to JavaScript, then you can do that as well. In the switchboard, you'll see that for the imposition file, so the run list file and the sheet config file, there now are also editors integrated. And so I can open that in there, and I can either have a classic run list, tab delimited, or I can have a JavaScript run list right in this editor. And as you can see here, the editor also supports syntax coloring and so on. So again, it makes it easier. Again, this is just integrated into the standard JavaScript environment of pdfToolbox, which means that if I want to write app.doc.pages to get information about all the pages in the document, then I can, just as I would do in a JavaScript variable. If I want to write app.requires to prompt the user for a variable, or because I want to use a variable, or if I want to use a variable that was defined somewhere previously in a process plan, then I can do those things as well. That is the advantage. Then what does that look like? Well, it's even easier in a way than in the case of the JavaScript controlled checks. In those JavaScript controlled checks, I had to always create an object with a particular structure. Here, I even have an impose object that is added by, or a class, if you want to have the right naming in JavaScript, that is added by pdfToolbox, and that then has convenience methods, convenience functions like add sheet def or add sheet, add page, and these make it easy to add all of the correct stuff to that imposition object that I then return to pdfToolbox. Yeah. Again, there is documentation for this, so you can start playing with that and test things. And that is also the last thing that I wanted to talk about. And the last line there is a reference to what Apple always says. Here's the functionality. We can't wait to see what you'll do with that. So that's what I wanted to share. As I said before, I am certain that there is a lot of things that I didn't have the time to show. There is more detail on help.callassoftware.com. There is more detail on the Callas Software channel on YouTube. And of course, you can always ask questions and so on. So if there are questions that haven't been answered meanwhile, or that you want to ask, then now would be a good time to ask them. There is one that I will ask, and I will convert it from German and will not read the German to you. That is safer for your ears. The question is it possible to convert an old format run lists into JavaScript? That would be really cool, but the answer is no. Perhaps it is possible, I don't know. Actually, I don't think it would be that easy to do that, but no, at the moment not. Yeah. And I think that all of the other things have been answered. So that actually puts us more or less on time. That's a bit optimistic, I know, but still. So thank you very much for joining. This was the last 4-piece cafe for the year. We're taking a little winter break in December, and then once everyone is done partying after Christmas and end of year, then we will be back with more content. I don't know exactly when yet, but that will be shared, of course, and you'll be able to register for the new sessions when they have been planned. For now, thank you to everyone to join this one. Try out pdfToolbox 13. Like I said, this is again a major update with lots of new stuff in the product. If you find something that doesn't work or that you're still missing, let us know. I hope that by now it is also clear that Callas has a habit of listening when people are asking for things. I can't guarantee you if you ask something that it is going to be implemented, but I can guarantee you, I can absolutely guarantee you that if you don't ask, it's not going to be implemented. So if you are missing something, speak up, send an email to Callas, send an email to us, send an email to me. It will always end up in the right place. As this is the last cafe of the year, let me probably be the first to to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a good end of year. And we will see each other in 2022 at a next cafe. Have fun, everyone.